She was 11 when her mother pressed a palm flat against the plastered wall behind the stove. The fire had burned out hours before supper. The iron was cold to the touch, but the wall was warm, a deep, patient warmth that pushed back against her small hand when she placed it beside her mother's. Birch smoke hung in the kitchen. Light from the stove door fell orange across the floor. Her mother said 5 words. She carried them across an ocean without knowing why. Now she stood in a cabin on the Dakota Plains with 2 children, a dead husband, and a woodpile that would not last until Christmas. Peter Brecke had been dead for 3 days when Ragna finally stopped reaching for his side of the bed. She stood at the cabin door that October morning, 7.5 wagon miles southeast of Minot, and counted what she had. 1 1/4 cords of cottonwood stacked against the north sod bank. 1 sack of lignite coal so poor it crumbled when she squeezed a lump. 6 bundles of twisted hay that Peter had braided the week before the cottonwood slipped. And a cabin that still leaked air under the south sill where Peter had not finished chinking. Eli, 9 years old and already moving like someone who understood silence, stood behind her with a water pail. Marte, 6, sat on the bed coughing into a rag. The cough had started in September. It had not stopped. The Mouse River flats stretched gray and flat to the east. Frost had come early. The grass along the bank was already brittle, snapping underfoot like small bones. Somewhere south of town, the Northern Pacific crews were stripping the last cottonwood stands for railroad ties and bunkhouse fuel. Every tree they dropped was a tree Ragna could not reach. She had $34.70 of debt at Haskell's store: flour, nails, stovepipe, salt pork. Peter had signed for it in August, when a winter together in a finished cabin seemed like simple arithmetic. Now the arithmetic had changed. The cabin was 16 by 20 feet, 1 good wall, the north, banked with sod and holding, 1 bad wall, the south, where wind found the gaps and the plank boards bowed outward when the gusts hit. The cast iron cookstove sat in the center of the room like a hungry animal. It threw heat while burning and went cold the moment the fire died. Ragna had fed it 2 armloads of cottonwood the night before just to keep the water bucket from skinning over with ice. 2 armloads in 1 night. She did the math standing in that doorway because the math was all she had left. 6 cords of wood was the minimum a family needed to survive a Dakota winter in a cabin this size. 8 cords if January came mean, if the storms stacked up and the temperature dropped below 30 and stayed there for weeks. She had 1 1/4. She could not cut more. The nearest standing timber was 2 miles upriver, already claimed by railroad crews. She could not buy more. She had no money and no credit left. She could not borrow a team to haul it, because Peter's horse had broken its leg in the same accident that killed him, and the neighbor who shot the animal had not come back to say he was sorry. Eli set the water pail down by the stove. He did not ask what they were going to do. He was 9. He already knew that some questions had no answers worth speaking aloud. Ellen Voigt brought the cap on the 4th day. She rode in from the west on a gray mule, her own 5 children somewhere behind her in a soddy 3 miles out, and she carried Peter's wool cap frozen stiff at the brim. She had found it on the riverbank where the cottonwood load had shifted. Ragna took the cap and held it. The wool smelled like river clay and pine pitch. She hung it on the nail by the door where Peter had always left it and turned back to the stove. Ellen stayed long enough to leave a jar of stewed rabbit and a look that said everything a sentence could not. The next morning, Reuben Tallow came. Reuben was 64, former Army teamster, claim inspector for the county before his knees went bad and the territory stopped paying. He had wintered on the northern plains since the 1860s, back when the Sioux still held the Missouri Breaks and the nearest white settlement was a tent with a flag. He had seen frozen cattle stacked like cordwood along the Yellowstone. He had pulled dead men out of line shacks where the stovepipe had collapsed under snow and the fire went out at 3 in the morning. He did not visit widows to offer sympathy. He visited to count. He walked the property without asking permission. Ragnar watched from the doorway as he circled the cabin, kicked the sod bank, pressed his palm against the south wall, and felt the draft. He stood at the woodpile for a long time. Then he opened the stove door, looked inside, closed it, and turned to face her. "You have a 16 by 20 shell," Reuben said. "One good wall, one bad wall that will let wind through by December, 1¼ cords of green cottonwood that will burn wet and throw half the heat of seasoned oak." He pointed at the stove. "That cookstove will eat 1/4 cord a week if you feed it right, and you are not feeding it right. You are burning too slow. The wood smolders, the creosote builds, and by January your pipe is a chimney fire waiting to happen." Ragnar said nothing. She knew the numbers. She had been counting since the morning after Peter died. Reuben stepped closer. His voice dropped. 6 cords is the bare minimum for a cabin this size with that stove. 8 if January comes mean. You have less than 2, and half of it is green. He looked past her to where Marte lay under a quilt, coughing. "You have 2 children, no team, no credit, and a debt at Haskell's that Pike is already circling." "I know what Pike wants," Ragnar said. "Then you know you cannot win her here." "I know what he wants," she said again. Reuben pulled his collar up. The wind was pushing clouds south across the flats, low and fast, the kind that carried the smell of ice. "I have seen women stronger than you freeze in better cabins than this," he said. "Pride does not burn." He left. His boot prints in the frozen mud stayed for 2 days before the next frost filled them. That night, Ragnar burned 2 more armloads, keeping Marte warm. The girl's cough had turned wet, rattling deep in her chest like a stone in a jar. Eli slept sitting up against the wall, his coat buttoned to his chin. By morning, the woodpile was visibly smaller. Ragnar marked the height with a line of charcoal on the endmost log. 1 week of October gone, 1 stack already lower. She tried the hay twists. She fed 3 bundles into the cookstove and watched them flare, bright and hot, a rush of orange that heated the stovetop fast enough to warm her palms. Then they were gone. 40 seconds of heat. The stove cooled. The cabin cooled. Marte coughed. Ragnar stood over the stove with her hands on the warming lid, and she understood for the first time that the problem was not only the size of the woodpile. The problem was what happened to the heat after the wood burned. It went up. It went through the pipe, through the collar, through the chimney stack, and out into the Dakota sky. She was feeding the stove, and the stove was feeding the wind. She could not grow the pile. She could not stop the wind. The question was whether she could change what happened in between. The memory came at night, the way memories do, not summoned but arriving, like a draft under a door you thought was sealed. She was 11. Her mother, Barbro Brecka, stood in the kitchen of their house near Telemark, one palm pressed flat against the plastered wall behind the Norwegian masonry stove. The stove had been cold to the touch for hours. The fire had burned out before supper, but the wall was warm. Ragna had put her own small hand beside her mother's and felt it, steady heat, deep heat, the kind that seemed to come from inside the stone itself. "Heat is not fire," Barbro had said. "Heat is what stays after fire leaves." That was all. A sentence spoken once in a kitchen in Norway. Ragna had carried it across the Atlantic, across Minnesota, across the open plains to Dakota Territory, and had never once thought it was important. Now she stood over the cookstove in a cabin that was killing her children, and the sentence came back with the force of something that had been waiting. She put her hand above the chimney collar. The heat was fierce there, racing upward, desperate to leave. She hung a damp mitten near the elbow of the stove pipe and another near the stove body. The pipe mitten dried in minutes. The stove mitten took an hour. The pipe was stealing heat faster than the stove could give it to the room. Eli came up behind her. "Why does the pipe get hot if the fire is for us?" Ragna looked at her son. She looked at the pipe. She looked at the floor. "Because we are letting it leave," she said. The idea did not arrive whole. It arrived the way Petter's cottonwood had arrived, in pieces that needed cutting, fitting, and stacking before they became anything useful. But the core was there, planted by Barbro's palm against a warm wall, a continent, and a lifetime ago. The cookstove sent its heat up and out. The hot exhaust, smoke, gas, radiating energy raced through the pipe and vanished into the sky. What if the pipe did not go straight up? What if it went down first? What if the exhaust traveled through a sealed iron path buried in something heavy, something dense, something that could absorb heat the way stone absorbed heat, and then release it slowly, not in minutes, not while the fire burned, but for hours afterward? Sand, river sand, dry, dense, heavy, and free. The Mouse River bend was half a mile away, and the banks were thick with pale quartz sand deposited by spring floods. Dry sand weighed near 97 pounds to the cubic foot. It held heat the way a stone wall held heat. Not forever, but long enough to stretch a 1-hour fire into 6 hours of warmth, long enough to let the woodpile last. Ragna pulled the floorboards near the stove and looked at the crawl space beneath. Hard-packed dirt, 3 feet of clearance before the frozen ground, enough room for a pit. The design built itself in her mind over 2 days, shaped by logic, by memory, and by the simple geometry of iron pipe and sand. She would dig a pit beneath the floor, 8 feet long, 8 feet wide, 3 feet and 3 inches deep. She would line the sides with clay from the riverbank, packed and smoothed. She would lay 6-inch iron pipe in a long S-shaped path through the sand bed, 3 long passes connected by elbows, sealed at every joint. The pipe would slope upward, a 1/4 inch per foot, so the draft would still pull and the smoke would not stall. At the end of the run, the pipe would rise through a straight vertical section into the existing chimney stack. 2 clean-out points made from cut lard cans would allow her to scrape soot from the horizontal runs. Then she would pack the pit with dry river sand, tight around the pipe, leaving 2 inches of clay and fieldstone above the pipe before the sand reached board level. The floorboards would go back down, numbered in charcoal so each one returned to its place. When she fired the stove, the exhaust would travel the long path through the sand bed before escaping up the chimney. The sand would absorb the heat. When the fire died, the sand would give the heat back slowly, upward through the floor, into the room where her children slept. 8 feet by 8 feet by 3 1/4 feet. 208 cubic feet of sand, tamped dry. She did the arithmetic with a stick in the ashtray, scratching numbers the way Peter had scratched lumber counts on the doorframe. 97 pounds per cubic foot, 20,176 pounds, just over 10 tons. 10 tons of river sand, buried under her stove. The risk calculation came next, and she did not flinch from it. If the pipe joints leaked, stove gas, carbon monoxide, would seep through the sand and the floorboards and poison the children in their sleep. If the pipe ran too flat, smoke would back into the cabin. If she used wet sand, steam would rot the boards from below, and the whole floor would collapse into a sour pit. If the sand bed stole too much heat too quickly, the chimney would lose its draw and the stove would choke. Any one of those failures could kill them faster than the cold. She sat on the floor that night after the children slept and pressed her palm to the boards, the way her mother had pressed her palm to the wall in Telemark. The boards were cold. The crawl space below was colder. 10 tons was a weight that seemed impossible for one woman, one boy, and a 6-year-old who could barely carry a bucket. But 1¼ cords of wood against a 6-month winter was also impossible. The old way was already a death sentence. The new way was only a gamble. Ragna chose the gamble. Ellen Voigt came back 3 days later, not out of friendship, but out of the particular obligation that frontier neighbors carried whether they wanted to or not. She found Ragna on her knees, prying up floorboards with a claw hammer, stacking them against the north wall in numbered order. Charcoal marks on each board, 1, 2, 3, like a woman labeling her own coffin. Ellen stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing to your floor?" Ragna did not look up. "Making room." "For what?" "Sand." Ellen stepped inside. She looked at the open pit, the bare crawl space dirt already marked with string lines, the stovepipe sections Pater had bought for a summer kitchen he would never build. She looked at Ragna's face, streaked with dirt and something harder than dirt. "A stove belongs above a floor," Ellen said, "not under it." "The stove stays where it is," Ragna said. "The pipe goes underneath." Ellen was 37, German-American, the mother of 5 children who were alive because she did not take risks. Her husband farmed 90 acres of flat ground and kept enough firewood to burn through April because he started cutting in June. She understood the plains the way a woman understands a man who hits. You survived by knowing the rules, not by rewriting them. You're putting stovepipe under your floor. Sealed pipe in dry sand. And if it leaks? Then I will know before the children do, because I will be the one sleeping closest to the floor. Ellen said nothing for a moment. Then she said what the audience would say, the question any reasonable person would ask. "How do you know the sand holds heat?" Ragna stood. She crossed to the stove, picked up 2 fist-sized field stones from the pile near the wood box. One had been sitting in the shade by the door. One had been warming near the stove body since morning. She wrapped both in squares of wool cloth and put one in each of Ellen's hands. "Hold them until after supper," Ragna said. Ellen held them. She came back an hour later. The shade stone was cold. The stove stone still pushed warmth through the wool into her palms. "That is 1 stone," Ellen said. "You're talking about 10 tons. I am talking about the same principle, 10 tons heavy." Ellen was not convinced, but she stopped laughing. She set the warm stone down on the table and left without saying whether she would come back. Nathan Pike heard about the floor before the first board was back in place. Pike was 42, freight contractor, land buyer, the kind of man the frontier produced in quantity, sharp enough to read a contract, patient enough to wait for a widow to break. He had come west from Ohio with enough capital to buy freight wagons and enough sense to buy distressed claims on the side. He held Ragna's store debt through Haskell, had taken the paper off the storekeeper's hands in exchange for a discount on kerosene. And he wanted the Brecka claim because the river bend had sand, grass, and wagon access. 3 things a freight yard needed. 1 dead husband was all that stood between Pike and a signature. He framed his hostility as mercy. That was the particular cruelty of men like Pike. They dressed the knife in kindness and called it charity. He arrived on a Tuesday, riding a sorrel gelding while Ragna and Eli were shaking river sand through a grain screen beside the cabin. The sand fell pale and fine through the mesh. The heavier gravel stayed behind. Pike dismounted and watched without greeting. I heard you pulled your floor up, Pike said. Ragna kept screaming. The sand hissed through the mesh like water through a sieve. I want to offer you a way out, Pike said. Clear your debt at Haskell's, $34.70. You sign a quitclaim on the property by November 1st, and you walk clean. I will even arrange passage to Bismarck for you and the children. Ragna shook the screen. Sand fell. Gravel stayed. A woman alone cannot winter this place, Pike said. His voice carried the patient tone of a man who had made this speech before to other widows in other Octobers. Better she signs before the children pay for pride. Ragna set the screen down. She looked at Pike for the first time. His coat was wool, double-breasted, the kind that cost money in Fargo and looked like money in Minot. His boots were oiled. His hands were clean. I know what this land is worth to you, she said. It is worth $34.70 to me, that is all. Then you're not good at numbers. Pike's jaw tightened. He looked past her to the open floor, the pit marked with string lines, the sacks of pale sand leaning against the cabin wall. What is that? That is my floor. That is a grave, Pike said. You're building a grave under your stove, and your children will lie in it. He pointed at the pit. By Christmas, either that stove smokes you out or the cold does. I've seen it before. Ragna picked up the screen and shook it again. Sand fell. Pike waited. She did not speak. By Christmas, he said again. You will know. Then come Christmas, Ragna said without looking up. You will know too. Pike mounted and rode back toward town. Ragna watched him go. When the horse disappeared behind the rise, she tipped another sack of sand through the screen and carried the bucket inside. Word spread from Haskell's store the way word always spread, in low voices over counters, in wagons on the road, in the particular grammar of pity that frontier communities used to discuss women who would not listen. She's hauling the river into her kitchen. She's burying stovepipe under her floor. She has 2 children and no man and a head full of Norwegian foolishness. 2 railroad workers passing her homestead saw the sacks piled by the door and called it a beach for ghosts. The phrase stuck. By the end of the week, even Ellen Voigt had heard it. Reuben Tallow heard the rumors and came back, angrier than before. He did not care about the gossip. He cared about the children. He stood in the cabin and looked at the open floor, the pit half dug, the numbered boards stacked against the wall, and his face went hard in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with 20 winters of counting the dead. You are gambling with their lives, he said. I am gambling with their lives either way, Ragna said. The difference is which gamble gives them better odds. Reuben left without answering, because there was no answer that did not admit she was right about the math. Construction began in earnest on October 29th. Ragna woke before dawn, fed the stove 1 armload. She could not afford more, and began digging while the children ate cold biscuits left from the night before. The crawlspace dirt was hard, packed by years of frost and thaw, and her spade bounced off the surface 3 times before she found a rhythm. Eli held the lantern. Marte sat on the bed and watched with eyes that were too old for 6. Day 1, Ragna lifted floorboards in a 6 by 8 foot section and discovered what October had already done to the crawlspace. Frost had hardened the top 3 inches of soil into a shell that rang like pottery when the spade struck it. Beneath the shell, the dirt was still workable, dark and gritty, laced with river clay. She dug for 4 hours and moved enough earth to fill the space under the bed. Her palms split on the spade handle by noon. Day 2. She expanded the pit to the full 8 by 8 feet because the arithmetic would not bend. 10 tons of sand needed volume. She carved the walls square and tamped them with the flat of the spade. Eli hauled the loose dirt outside in buckets and dumped it against the south wall, where Ragna planned to bank it for insulation. Marte sorted field stones into 2 piles, flat ones for under the pipe elbows, round ones for the wall lining. She coughed between every 3rd stone. Day 3. Ragna's palms bled through the rag wraps she had tied around her hands. The blisters had opened on day 2, and the cold clay packed into the raw skin with every stroke. She dug. Eli hauled. The pit reached 2 feet deep across the full 8x8 square. 3 feet 3 inches was the target. She was not halfway. The wind shifted north that afternoon, and the temperature dropped hard enough to freeze the water in the pail by the door. Ragna burned an extra armload that night. She marked the woodpile again. The charcoal line was lower than the last one. 1 1/4 cords was becoming 1 cord. The clock was not ticking. It was hammering. Day 4. Rasna laid out the first pipe run above ground, propped on field stones, to test the route before burying it. Pater's summer kitchen pipe sections were 6-inch diameter, iron, lightly rusted but sound. She connected 3 lengths with their factory crimps and set an elbow at each turn. The S shape needed to fit inside the 8x8 pit with room for sand on all sides. She measured twice, adjusted the elbows, measured again. The first layout failed. The second elbow pointed too low. If she buried the pipe this way, the low point would trap soot and condensation, and the smoke would stall before reaching the chimney rise. She would have to cut a section shorter and add a shim of flat stone under the elbow to maintain the 1/4 inch per foot rise. She sat on the cabin floor with iron pipe in her lap, a hacksaw that needed sharpening, and 2 children who needed supper. The stove was cold. She had not fed it since morning. Day 5. Ellen Voigt appeared at the door carrying 2 grain sacks and a shovel. She did not knock. She set the sacks on the floor, leaned the shovel against the wall, and said, "I am not saying this will work." Ragna did not ask why she came. On the frontier, women did not explain their reasons for helping. They helped, or they did not, and the explanation lived somewhere private between the fear of watching a neighbor die and the fear of being the neighbor who watched. Ellen screened sand. Ragna dug. Eli hauled. The pit reached 2 feet 8 inches by sundown, 5 more inches to go. Day 6. The river sand froze overnight. A crust of ice formed over the sand pile by the bank, and when Ragna struck it with the spade, the whole surface fractured into pale plates that had to be broken, chipped, carried to the cabin, spread near the stove to thaw, dried, and then screened before it could be packed. Every bucket of sand cost heat before it could store heat. The irony was not lost on her. She fed the stove 2 armloads to dry the sand that was supposed to save her from needing so much firewood. The woodpile dropped again. Day 7. Pike sent word through Haskell that no more credit would be extended unless Ragna signed the quitclaim. Haskell himself brought the message, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who owed Pike money and could not afford to be generous. "I am sorry, Mrs. Brecky," he said. "He holds the paper." Ragna nodded. She asked Haskell to tell Pike that her answer was the same as before. That night, Eli fell asleep against the wall again, his boots still on, his hands still gray with clay. Ragna sat on the edge of the open pit and listened to Marte cough. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the wind found the south wall and pushed through the gaps like a living thing, searching for warmth to steal. She had a pit nearly dug to depth. She had pipe sections laid out above ground. She had no mentor, no mason, no one who had ever built what she was trying to build. She had a dead husband's summer kitchen pipe, a memory of her mother's hand on a warm wall, and a 6-year-old whose cough sounded worse every night. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only saw the risk, not the reason? Ragna had no proof yet, only an open floor and one more day of digging before the pipe went in. The pit waited. The cold waited. Somewhere east of Minot, a November blizzard was building over the open plains, stacking itself in layers of cloud and wind and frozen air, and it did not care whether Ragna's floor was finished. She picked up the spade. 5 more inches. The pit reached full depth on the 8th day of digging, 3 feet, 3 inches. Ragna stood inside it, and her head cleared the floor joists by less than a hand's width. The walls were tamped clay, dark and smooth, where the spade had pressed them. The air smelled of wet earth and iron and the faint sourness of a cabin that had not been properly warm in 2 weeks. She climbed out, lay on the remaining floorboards, and felt the gap in her house like a wound, 8 feet by 8 feet of open crawl space. The stove sat at the edge of it on its remaining platform of boards, and the children slept on the far side where the floor was still whole. Between them and the stove lay a pit that looked like a grave for something larger than a person. Eli had stopped asking questions. He hauled buckets. He stacked pipe sections. He fed the stove the 1 armload Ragna allowed each morning and the 1 she allowed each night. When Marte coughed, he brought her water without being told. He was 9 years old, and he moved through the cabin like a man who understood that language cost energy they could not spare. On the 9th day, Ragna began laying the pipe. She had 36 feet of 6-inch iron pipe, 3 long sections for the horizontal runs, connected by elbows at each turn, forming the S-shaped path that would force the exhaust to travel the full length of the sand bed before rising to the chimney. She set each section on fieldstone supports inside the pit, shimming the stones until a marble, Marte's single glass marble, borrowed and returned, rolled slowly toward the outlet end. 1/4-inch rise per foot. Torgrim Aasen had not yet taught her that phrase, but she had discovered the principle herself. The smoke had to want to climb. The first elbow joint was the problem. Factory crimps held straight sections together well enough, but the elbows had to be sealed. Smoke leaking from a joint inside a sand bed was not smoke you could see. It was stove gas, odorless, invisible, heavy enough to pool near the floor where children slept. Ragna knew this. She did not know how to solve it. She tried river clay packed around the joint. It cracked when the pipe heated. She tried clay mixed with hay fiber. It held longer but still split along the seam after the second test fire. She tried wrapping the joint with strips of tin cut from a lard pail. The tin buckled. By the 11th day, 3 joints were set, and none of them were sealed properly. The pipe route looked right. The slope was right. But the seams were wrong, and wrong seams in a buried pipe meant death in January. That was the day Torgrim Aasen walked onto the property. He did not arrive the way a savior arrives in stories, on horseback, at the critical moment, with light behind him. He arrived the way broken men arrived on the northern plains in the autumn of 1886, on foot, limping, carrying a canvas tool bag with a cracked handle, following the railroad grade east because the railroad had sent him west, and his hip had given out near Minot. Torgrim was 58, Norwegian. Born near Bergen, trained as a stonemason, emigrated to Minnesota in the 60s, and spent 20 years building chimneys, bake ovens, and masonry heaters in farmhouses from St. Paul to the Red River Valley. He had laid stone for 3 Norwegian-style ovens, the kind that routed exhaust through channels in a massive stone body before releasing it up the flue. He understood heat paths the way a carpenter understood grain, not as theory, but as material, as something you could feel with your hands and read with your eyes. His hip had failed while lifting rail ties near the Minot siding. The railroad crew had left him with a week's wages and a suggestion to find a doctor in town. The doctor in Minot cost money Torgrim did not have, so he walked. He stopped at Ragna's property because the numbered floorboards caught his eye. They were stacked against the north wall, charcoal numbers facing out. 1, 2, 3, 4. And beside them stood iron pipe sections propped on field stones, in a pattern that Torgrim recognized the way a musician recognizes a melody played on an unfamiliar instrument. He stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. Ragna looked up. "You are thinking in heat paths," he said. Ragna wiped clay from her forehead. "The joints will not seal." Torgrim set his tool bag on the remaining floor and lowered himself to one knee, favoring his left hip. He examined the nearest elbow joint without touching it. He leaned forward and smelled the clay. He pressed his thumb to the seam and rubbed the residue between his fingers. "Clay alone will not hold against iron expansion," he said. "Iron grows when it heats. The clay does not grow with it. The joint opens a hair's width, and a hair's width is enough." "I know," Ragna said. "I have tried clay with hay, and tin. The tin buckles." Torgrim looked at her the way Reuben Tallow had looked at her woodpile, with the practiced assessment of a man who counted before he spoke. But where Reuben had counted failure, Torgrim was counting competence. The pipe slope was correct. The fieldstone supports were level. The elbows pointed the right way. She had the geometry. She lacked the material. "Do you have ash?" he asked. "From the stove, yes." "Hair? Horsehair? Cowhair? Anything coarse?" "There is an old horse blanket in the lean-to. Pater's." "Mix the clay with ash and hair. Equal parts clay and ash, a handful of hair per bucket. The ash-itaiti-tight resists heat. The hair binds the mixture while it sets. Smear every joint before riveting, and rivet tight. When the pipe heats, the ash compound hardens instead of cracking." Ragna climbed out of the pit. She retrieved the horse blanket and began pulling coarse hairs from the weave. Eli fetched the ash bucket from behind the stove. Torgrim watched them work without offering to help, not out of laziness, but out of the particular respect of a craftsman who understood that the person building the thing must build it with their own hands or they would never trust it. He taught her the mixture by having her make it wrong first. Too much clay, sticky, prone to cracking. Too much ash, powdery, no adhesion. Too little hair, brittle when dry. She mixed 4 batches before the 5th felt right in her palm, dense, fibrous, slightly gritty, like mortar that had opinions. "Now seal the first joint," Torgrim said. "I will watch." She sealed it. He corrected her grip, told her to press harder at the seam lip where the crimp overlapped, and made her add a second layer around the rivet line. Then he had Eli light a twist of newspaper in the stove and watch the smoke path through the first 2 pipe sections. The smoke pulled. No leak at the sealed joint. The ash-clay hair compound held. Torgrim sat on the edge of the pit and rubbed his hip. "The slope is good," he said. "Who taught you the slope?" "No one," Ragna said. "I watched what happened when the pipe ran flat." He looked at her again with that measuring expression. Then he nodded once, the way men nod when they have decided something they do not intend to say aloud. He stayed. Over the next 5 days, Torgrim taught Ragna the things she could not discover alone, not because she lacked intelligence, but because masonry heating was a craft built across generations, and no single generation could reinvent it from scratch. He taught the draft principle through demonstration. He poured fine ash through a pipe section propped at different angles and showed how a flat run trapped soot in pockets that narrowed the draw. At the 1/4-inch rise, Ash particles slid slowly toward the outlet. At less than that, they settled and accumulated. At more than that, the exhaust moved too fast and carried heat past the sand before the sand could absorb it. "You want the smoke to linger," he said, "not stall. Lingering gives time for the sand to drink the heat. Stalling gives soot, and soot gives fire." He taught the dryness test by placing sand in a hot skillet on the stove. Wet sand spat and hissed and threw droplets of steam that smelled like river mud. Dry sand sat silent and took the heat without protest. He made Ragna spread every batch of sand in shallow wooden trays near the stove and wait until it passed the skillet test before packing it into the pit. "Wet sand in a heat bed will steam for weeks," he said. "Steam rots boards. Rot drops your floor into the pit, and then you sleep on sand." He taught thermal layering by making her stack materials in order. First the pipe, resting on fieldstone supports, then 2 inches of clay and flat stone above the pipe, tamped and leveled, then dry sand packed tight around and over everything, stopping 2 inches below board level. Then an air gap, then the floorboards. Each layer had a purpose. The clay and stone above the pipe distributed heat outward and prevented hot spots that could scorch the boards. The sand stored the heat. The air gap slowed the transfer enough to prevent the boards from charring. He taught the clean-out necessity by telling her what happened without one. "I once opened a masonry heater in Blue Earth County that had not been cleaned in 6 years, he said. "The channels were packed with osote, hard as coal. The farmer said the heater stopped working. I told him the heater was working fine. He had just buried it alive." He cut 2 access points in the pipe run, one near the first elbow, one near the last, and fashioned clean-out caps from lard cans with handles bent from baling wire. Ragna could lift the floorboard above each cap, pull the cap, and scrape the horizontal run with a rod. Without these, the whole system was a hidden chimney fire building itself in silence. On the 4th day with Torgrim, they clashed. Ragna wanted to pack the sand to the tops of the joists, maximizing thermal mass. Torgrim insisted on the 2-inch air gap below the boards. Ragna argued that more sand meant more stored heat. Torgrim argued that more sand touching the boards meant charred wood and a house fire. "You are thinking like a woman who is cold," he said. "Think like a woman whose floor is on fire." "I am thinking like a woman who has 1 cord of wood left," she said. 1 cord or none, a floor fire kills faster than the cold." They stood on opposite sides of the pit, the sand between them, and neither moved. Eli watched from the bed. Marte coughed. Ragna conceded. Not because Torgrim was louder, but because he was right, and she could tell the difference. The air gap stayed. That night, Torgrim sat near the stove and told her about the masonry heaters he had built in Norway and Minnesota. Tall stone structures, some of them weighing 2 tons or more, with exhaust channels that wound through the mass like a river through a canyon. A single hot fire, burned clean for 90 minutes, would heat the stone enough to warm a room for 12 hours. The principle was identical to what Ragna was building, scaled differently. "You are making a prairie version," he said. "Sand instead of stone, iron pipe instead of stone channels. But the physics does not care what material you use. It cares about mass, it cares about surface area, and it cares about time." "My mother knew this," Ragna said. "She pressed her hand to the wall and said heat is what stays." Torgrim looked at the stove. "Your mother was correct. The question is whether 10 tons is enough to outlast January." Neither of them answered, because the answer was coming whether they spoke it or not. November pressed down on the Dakota flats like a hand on a throat. By the 6th of November, the pit was packed. 208 cubic feet of dried, screened, tested river sand tamped around 36 feet of sealed iron pipe. Ragna's shoulders ached in a way that had moved past pain into a kind of numbness she carried like a second skeleton. Her hands had healed and split and healed again until the calluses lay thick as boot leather across both palms. Eli's boots had worn through at one heel, and he walked with a limp he tried to hide. They relaid the floorboards on November 9th. Each board went back to its numbered position. They did not sit perfectly flat. A faint hump rose under the stove, where the sandbed pushed the joists a fraction higher than before, as if the house were hiding something in its belly that it could not fully swallow. Torgrim had Ragna leave 2 small iron clean-out lids, accessible beneath a loose plank near the stove. She marked the plank with a circle of charcoal so she could find it in the dark. Then they lit the first fire. 6 split sticks of cottonwood and 2 hay twists. A small fire, barely enough to heat a kettle. But this fire had to travel. Ragna opened the stove draft and lit the hay. The twists caught. The sticks caught. The fire climbed fast and hot inside the iron box, and the stovepipe began to warm at the collar. But instead of rising straight to the chimney, the exhaust entered the pipe at a downward angle, dropped below the floor, and began its S-shaped journey through 10 tons of sand. Torgrim pressed his ear to the floorboard above the first pipe run. He listened. "I hear it," he said. "Moving." Ragna set 3 test stones, one on the stove body, one near the far wall, one on the floorboard directly above the center of the buried pipe run. She marked the time by the clock she kept wound on the shelf above Marte's bed. 1 hour. The stove body was hot. The far wall was cold. The floor stone was cool. 2 hours. The stove body was cooling. The far wall was still cold. The floor stone was warm. 4 hours. The stove body was barely warm. The far wall had not changed, but the floor stone was warm enough to hold in her hand like a living thing, and the floorboards around it were warm too, not hot, not scorching, warm the way skin is warm, warm the way her mother's wall had been warm in Telemark. Eli took his boots off and stood on the floor in his socks. His face changed. "It is warm," he said. He said it the way a child says something that does not make sense, quietly, as though the floor might hear him and stop. By morning, the stove lid was cold enough to touch. The far wall was still cold, but the water pail near the stove had not skimmed over with ice for the first time in 3 weeks. The floorboards held their warmth like a promise made by 10 tons of sand to one exhausted woman and 2 children who needed it. Reuben Tallow came the next day, because Reuben always came. He pressed his palm to the floor and held it there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "A mild night proves nothing." Ellen Voigt came the day after. She felt the boards and shook her head. Warm boards are not enough for a Dakota January. Pike heard about the warm floor at Haskell's store and said, "She's only made the cabin harder to repossess." None of them were wrong exactly. A mild November night and a small test fire proved only that the principle worked under gentle conditions. It proved nothing about what would happen when the temperature dropped to 20 below, to 30 below, to 40 below, when the wind drove snow horizontal across the flats, and the stovepipe screamed with gusts, and the fire was all that stood between a family and a death so cold it felt like sleep. The barometer at Haskell's store dropped sharply in late November. Railroad men complained that the telegraph west of town had gone silent. Ice on the lines, someone said. The wind shifted north and stayed there, and out on the open range, cattle began crowding the fence lines before noon, pressing south, pushing against wire that would not give, and the ranchers who had not yet shipped knew what that meant. Torgrim taught Ragnar the firing rhythm on the last day before his railroad crew ordered him east. He stood by the stove and spoke as though he were leaving instructions for someone who might not see him again. "Burn hot," he said. "Burn clean. 1 hour, no longer. Use dry wood, split thin. Let the flames run high and blue at the tips. The hotter and cleaner the fire, the more heat enters the sand and the less creosote builds in the pipe. After 1 hour, shut the stove draft low. Do not choke it. A choked fire smolders, and smolder feeds the pipe with tar instead of heat. Close the pipe damper only after the last blue flame is gone. If you close it while coals still burn, you trap the gas below the floor." He made her repeat the sequence. She repeated it. He made her repeat it again with her eyes closed. She did. "Now the rhythm," he said. "Morning, 1 hot burn, 1 hour. Midday, open the draft and let the pipe breathe for 10 minutes without fire. The air flowing through clears moisture from the sand. Evening, 1 more hot burn, 1 hour. Between burns, the sand does the work." Ragnar nodded. "You will be tempted to burn longer when the cold gets bad." Torgrim said, "Do not. A long, slow burn sends half its heat up the chimney as waste. A short, fierce burn sends the heat into the sand where it belongs. Trust the mass." He picked up his canvas tool bag. His hip was worse than when he had arrived, and he leaned on the doorframe when he stood. The railroad crew needed him at a bridge approach east of town before the next storm closed the line. "If January is what I think it will be," Torgrim said, "you will know in the first hour whether the bed holds." He left. Ragnar watched him walk east along the railroad grade until his shape dissolved into the gray line where the sky met the plains. Then she turned back to the stove, opened the draft, and built the evening fire exactly the way he had taught her. On a night at 10 below, Ragnar burned half the expected wood. At dawn, the wall thermometer near the children's bed read 56. Low, but survivable. The floor above the sand bed was warm enough to dry socks laid flat against the boards. The sand was holding. The pipe was drawing. The joints were sealed. And out beyond the flats, past the railroad grade and the river bend and the stripped cottonwood stands, the weather was building something that had not been seen on the northern plains in a generation. The blizzard came on the 11th of January, 1887, and it came the way the worst things come, not with a warning, but with a lie. The morning was mild, 30 degrees, cloudy, but not dark. Ragnar fed the stove its morning fire and let Eli carry water from the barrel by the door. Marte's cough had eased since the floor warmed, and for the first time in weeks, the girl ate a full biscuit without stopping to catch her breath. By noon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, it had dropped another 10. The wind swung north and began to build, not gusting but pressing, a steady wall of air that pushed the cabin door inward on its hinges and drove snow under the south sill in thin white lines. By nightfall, the thermometer outside read 8 below zero and falling. The wind was no longer a wall. It was a fist. It struck the cabin from the north, driving snow sideways across the flats, packing it against the south wall until the window dimmed from gray to blue to something close to darkness. Ragnar sealed the south sill with rags and mud. She hung a blanket over the window. She built the evening fire, hot and clean, 1 hour, the way Torgrim had taught, and watched the stovepipe glow faintly at the collar while the exhaust dropped below the floor and entered the sand bed. The railroad line stalled somewhere west of Minot. Freight could not reach the smaller settlements. The telegraph was dead. No one was coming and no one was leaving. By midnight, the thermometer read 22 below, and the wind had not paused. By dawn, 28 below. By the second morning, the thermometer outside read 36 below zero, and the wind had packed the north sod bank with snow so dense that Ragna could not open the back vent. She cleared it with the fire poker, breaking chunks of compacted snow and ice from the opening while the wind blew crystals into her face hard enough to draw blood from her lower lip. Marte's cough came back. It started as a dry rattle in the late afternoon, the kind of sound Ragna had learned to track the way she tracked the woodpile, by frequency, by depth, by the space between each one. By evening, the cough was wet. By midnight, Marte's forehead was hot enough to make Ragna's palm pull back. Fever. Ragna built a fire. Not the scheduled morning fire, an extra fire. She burned 4 split sticks and fed them fast and hot, and the stove roared for 40 minutes while Eli held wet cloths to Marte's forehead. The floor above the sand bed was warm. The stove was throwing heat, but the far wall was cold, and the draft under the south sill had returned despite the rags, and Marte lay between warm floor and cold air and burned with a fever that had no interest in Ragna's engineering. Then Ragna went to clear the chimney outlet. The outlet stack rose through the roof and extended 2 feet above the ridge. Ice and driven snow had crusted around the cap, narrowing the draw. She climbed onto the sod bank on the north side, bracing her boots against frozen earth, and reached for the cap with a rag-wrapped hand. Her boot slipped. She fell sideways, caught herself on the roof edge, and dragged her left forearm across the frozen stovepipe support wire. The wire sliced through her sleeve and opened a gash from wrist to elbow, not deep enough to see bone, but deep enough that the blood came fast and dark and steamed when it hit the frozen sod. Eli found her sitting against the north wall with her arm wrapped in her apron, her face white, the chimney cap still crusted with ice. "Boil cloth," she said, "the clean piece from the trunk." He boiled it. He wrapped the wound. He did not cry because crying cost time, and time was the one thing this storm was taking from them faster than anything else. Ragna went back inside. She cleared the chimney from below, using the fire poker to knock ice loose from the interior of the cap, listening for the change in draft that told her the opening was clear. The fire recovered its pull. The exhaust began moving through the sand bed again, but her arm throbbed with every heartbeat, and the cloth was already soaking through. 40 below zero by the third morning, the wind had not stopped, and then the knock came. Thomas Voigt was 13 years old, and he stood at Ragna's door with frost on his eyelashes and one bare hand clenched around the other. His lips were gray. His coat was unbuttoned. He had run 3/4 of a mile through a whiteout at 40 below because the stove in his mother's soddy had cracked at the firebox seam and smoke had driven them out. "Mama says," he started. He could not finish. His teeth were hitting each other in a rhythm that had nothing to do with speech. Ragna pulled him inside. She sat him near the stove and wrapped a quilt around him. Eli brought water. Marte watched from the bed with fever-bright eyes. "Where's your mother?" Ragna asked. "The lean-to," Tomas said. "The cow lean-to with the little ones." 3/4 of a mile, in a whiteout, at 40 below. Ragna looked at her children, Eli standing by the stove with the fire poker still in his hand, Marte coughing into her pillow with a fever that had not broken. She looked at the stove, the warm floor, the single armload of wood remaining by the hearth with 3 split sticks in reserve and 2 sacks of hay twists. If she left, her children risked the fire going cold. If she stayed, Ellen's family might freeze in a lean-to built for a cow. She knelt beside Eli. "You know the firing sequence." Eli's face was still. Hot and clean, 1 hour, draft low, not choked, Damper closed after the last blue flame. If Marte's fever gets worse, put wet cloth on her head and keep the floor warm. Do not burn more than 1 armload. I know. She tied a rope from the door handle to the fence post 12 feet from the cabin. The fence posts ran south in a line she knew by memory. She had helped Peter set them in August. In clear weather, Ellen's place was visible from the rise. In this weather, Ragna could not see the fence post from the door. She wrapped her face in wool, pulled her coat tight over the bandaged arm, and stepped into the wind. The cold was not a temperature. It was a force. It struck her body the way a wave strikes a swimmer, a physical blow that drove the breath from her lungs and replaced it with something that tasted like metal and smelled like nothing at all. She found the first fence post by touch. She found the second by following the wire. She lost a mitten at the third post and shoved her bare hand inside her coat against her stomach. She reached the lean-to in what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour. Ellen was inside with 2 children, her youngest 4, and a girl of 7, wrapped in blankets that were not enough. The cow was dead. It had frozen standing up and now leaned against the wall like a terrible piece of furniture. "Can you walk?" Ragna asked. Ellen's face was past fear. It had arrived at the place beyond fear, where the body begins to shut down, and the mind starts telling stories about how sleep would be fine, sleep would be warm, sleep would solve everything. "You have to walk," Ragna said. She took the youngest. Ellen took the 7-year-old. They followed the fence wire back. Ragna carried the child against her chest and felt the small body shaking with a violence that seemed too large for something that weighed so little. They reached the cabin. Ragna went back for Thomas's older sister, who had been in the privy when the stove cracked and had sheltered behind the sod wall. She was conscious, but could not feel her feet. Two trips through a whiteout at 40 below zero with a gashed arm and 1 mitten. The cabin now held 7 people: Ragna, Eli, Marte, Ellen, Thomas, the youngest, the 7-year-old, and the older sister. Wet wool hung from every nail. Steam rose from coats piled near the stove. Marte's fever held. Ellen's youngest would not stop shaking. 7 people, 1 stove, 1 armload of wood, 3 split sticks, 2 sacks of hay twists, and 10 tons of sand. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next 12 hours decide whether Ragna's buried floor is shelter or just one more mistake. Ragna built the fire at 9 that evening, hot and clean. She fed it every stick she had measured for the night burn and let the flames climb until the stove body glowed dull red at the seams. The pipe above the stove warmed. The exhaust dropped below the floor and entered the sand bed. She held her bandaged arm against her body and watched the stove with the focused attention of a woman who understood that this fire was not heating a room. It was charging a battery made of river sand. 1 hour. The fire burned. The cabin warmed. 7 bodies gave off their own heat, and the wet wool steamed, and the windows ran with condensation that froze at the edges. Ellen sat on the warm floor and held her youngest and said nothing. Ragna closed the draft at the 1-hour mark. She watched the flames slow. She watched the coals dim from orange to red to a deep pulsing crimson that threw shadows on the walls. When the last blue flame vanished from the coal bed, she closed the pipe damper. The fire was out. Reuben Tallow's voice played in her head. Feed the stove. That was the conventional wisdom. That was what every settler on the northern plains had done for every winter since white people had been foolish enough to live here. When the cold gets bad, feed the stove. When the cold gets worse, feed it more. The stove is life. The fire is life. Let the fire go out, and you have chosen to die. Torgrim's voice answered. Trust the mass. At 10 that night, The stove body was cooling. The cabin air temperature near the ceiling was dropping, but the floor was warm. Ragna pressed her palm to the boards, the same gesture her mother had made in Telemark, the same gesture that had started everything, and felt steady heat rising through the wood. At midnight, the stove was cold to the touch. Ellen's oldest girl woke and reached for the stove and pulled her hand back, confused. The stove was not warm, but the floor was. She lay back down on the blanket spread over the boards and slept. At 3 in the morning, the fire was a memory. The cabin should have been freezing. The thermometer outside read 41 below. The coldest Ragna had ever seen it, colder than Reuben had ever warned, cold enough to kill a horse in an hour and a child in less. The thermometer near the stove read 64. The floor above the sand bed was warm enough that Marte had kicked her blanket off in her sleep. The sand was giving back what the fire had given it, not fast, not in a rush of heat that faded in minutes, the way the hay twists faded, slowly, steadily, the way a stone wall gives back heat in a Norwegian farmhouse after the fire has been dark for hours. Trust the mass. Ragna did not sleep. She sat against the wall and watched 7 people breathing on her floor and felt the warmth coming up through the boards against her back and counted the hours until dawn. At 5 in the morning, she built the second fire. 4 sticks. Not a full armload because she could not afford a full armload. Hot and clean. 1 hour. The stove roared and the pipe heated, and the exhaust traveled its buried S-shaped path through 10 tons of sand that was already warm and took the new heat on top of the old heat like a well that fills but does not overflow. By noon, the thermometer near the stove read 72. By evening, after the second burn of the day, the central room above the sand bed rose to 75. The far wall stayed in the 50s, cold, but survivable. The zone above the sand was warm enough that Ellen's youngest finally stopped shaking. Outside, the storm continued. Pike's hired man, Jory Venn, tried to reach an abandoned line shack east of the river and lost the trail. Reuben Tallow found him 2 days later, delirious, slumped against the livery wall in Minot with 3 fingers black on his left hand and his speech gone to mumbling. Another neighbor's cow froze in a lean-to that had seemed adequate in October. 2 railroad workers in a bunkhouse near the siding burned their entire winter wood supply in 4 days and sat in the cold on the 5th day until the section boss dragged them to the depot. In Ragna's cabin, wet mittens steamed on the warm floor. Children slept on blankets over boards that held the heat of a fire that had gone dark hours ago. Marty's fever broke before dawn on the 2nd day, and she opened her eyes and asked for water, and when Eli brought it, the cup was not frozen. Torgrim arrived on the 3rd day. His railroad crew's handcar had stalled on ice 8 miles east of Minot. He walked. His ears were frostbitten, the tips white and hard, the skin below them red and swollen, and his face was the gray of a man who had been measuring the distance between himself and death for hours and knew the margin was thin. He came through the door and stood on the floor and felt the heat rising through his boots. He looked at the stove. It was cold. He looked at the floor. It was warm. He looked at Ragna sitting against the wall with a blood-soaked bandage on her arm and 7 people alive behind her. "You kept the path hot," he whispered. Ragna did not answer. She brought him a blanket and a cup of warm water and sat him on the floor where the sand bed was deepest and the heat rose strongest. After 48 hours of the worst storm the northern plains had seen in a generation, Ragna had burned a fraction of what the conventional method demanded. Her winter pile, the pile Reuben Tallow had counted and condemned, the pile that was supposed to kill her family by February, still held more than half its wood. 7 people were alive. The pipe joints held. The sand held. The floor held. Outside, the wind finally paused. The sky cleared to a cold so deep the stars seemed close enough to touch, bright and hard and merciless, in the way that clear weather is merciless after a storm, because it means the cold has won its argument with the clouds, and now there is nothing between you and the infinite dark except whatever you have built. Ragna pressed her palm to the floor. The floor pressed back. The storm broke on the fourth day. The wind died between two breaths of the clock, and the silence that replaced it was so complete that Ellen's youngest woke up and cried because she thought she had gone deaf. Ragna opened the door to a world remade in white. Snow lay in sculpted drifts against every vertical surface, the woodpile buried to its third row, the lean-to leaning harder than before, the fence posts standing like sentries in white helmets. The sky was pale and clear, and so cold it hurt to look at. The thermometer outside read 31 below in the windless morning air. Inside, the floor was warm. Reuben Tallow arrived before noon. He came on foot because his mule would not cross the drifts, and he came fast because he had expected to find bodies. He had lain awake on the last night of the blizzard in his soddy north of the railroad grade and done the arithmetic the way he always did. The Breaky cabin, 1 cord of wood, 2 children, a widow with no help and no sense, and the arithmetic had told him what it always told him. He had seen the numbers kill before. He trusted the numbers. He stopped in the doorway. 7 people were inside. Wet wool hung from nails on every wall. The stove was cold. A child he did not recognize, Ellen's youngest, sat on the floor in her stockings playing with a field stone. The floor was steaming faintly where someone had spilled water near the stove, and the steam rose in a thin curl that should not have existed in a cabin with a dead fire. Reuben stepped inside. He knelt. He pressed his palm to the floorboards the way Ragna had pressed hers, the way Barbro Brecka had pressed hers in Telemark a generation before, and he held it there for a long time. The floor was warm. He looked at the stove, cold. He looked at the woodpile by the wall, the pile he had counted in October, the pile he had condemned as a death sentence. More than half of it remained, stacked, dry, unburned. "I told you 6 cords are coffins," Reuben said. He did not stand. His hand stayed on the floor. "I was wrong about one of those." He was not a man who apologized easily, and this was not an apology. It was an admission delivered in the only language Reuben trusted. Measurement. He asked to see the pit. Ragna lifted the loose plank and showed him the clean-out lid, the packed sand visible around the pipe joint, the iron still faintly warm to the touch, 8 hours after the last fire. He asked about the pipe route. She drew it on the floor with charcoal, the S-shape, the slope, the elbows, the rise to the chimney. He asked about the joints. She showed him the ash clay hair compound, the rivet pattern, the seam where the first joint had failed and been resealed. He asked about the wood consumption. Ragna showed him the charcoal marks on the woodpile, each mark a week, each gap a measure of what the stove had eaten. During the blizzard, with 7 people in the cabin and temperatures below 40, she had burned roughly 1/3 the daily wood that a conventional stove demanded in that cold. The sand bed did not create heat. It captured heat that would have fled up the chimney and held it where bodies could use it. Reuben stood, his knees cracked. He looked at Ragna with an expression she had not seen before. Not respect exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man who has been certain about something for 64 years and has just been shown he was certain about the wrong thing. "I will bring 2 settlers to see this," he said, "but they listen to you, not to me. I know cold. I do not know this." He left. His tracks in the fresh snow pointed north, and they did not waver. Ellen Voigt's conversion happened without ceremony, the way most real changes happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small evidence that eventually becomes too heavy to deny. She had spent 2 nights on Ragna's floor. She had felt the heat rise through the boards while the fire was dark. She had watched her youngest stop shaking on a floor that should have been frozen. She had slept in a cabin where the stove was cold and the air was warm, and the physics of it made no sense by any rules she had ever been taught. On the 5th day after the storm, Ellen came back alone. She did not bring food or cloth or any of the small offerings that frontier women carried when they visited. She brought a measuring stick. "Show me the pipe," she said. Ragna showed her everything: the pit dimensions, the pipe route, the joint compound, the clean-out caps, the slope, 1/4-inch rise per foot, measured with a straight board and a marble, the dryness test, sand in a skillet, no spit, no steam, the firing rhythm, hot and clean, 1 hour, draft low, damper closed after the last blue flame. Ellen wrote nothing down. She measured. She touched the pipe joints with her fingers and felt the compound. She pressed her hand to the sand and held it the way Reuben had held his hand to the floor. "My washhouse stove has a 6-inch pipe," Ellen said. "The washhouse is 12 by 14. Smaller than this. Could I build a smaller version?" "Smaller pit. 4 tons instead of 10. Shorter pipe run. Maybe 20 feet in 2 passes instead of 3. Same principles. Same joint compound. Same firing rhythm. Could I do it alone?" "You have 5 children. You have help I did not have." Ellen looked at Ragna's bandaged arm, the blood still showing through the cloth wrap. She looked at the floor that held the heat of a fire that had saved her family. "I was wrong about the stove belonging above the floor," Ellen said. "You were right to doubt," Ragna said. "Doubt is not the problem. Doubt without looking is the problem." Ellen took her measuring stick and left. She began digging her wash-house pit the following week. By late January, the word had spread past Ragna's immediate neighbors. Reuben brought the 2 settlers he had promised. Halvor Moen, a wheat farmer whose cabin sat exposed on a treeless ridge 3 miles west, and Peter Stensland, a younger man who had lost a milk cow and most of his hay supply in the storm. They stood in Ragna's cabin and pressed their palms to the floor and looked at the cold stove and said very little. Halvor asked how much sand his ridge had. The answer was not much. His land was clay and rock, not river bottom. Ragna told him that clay worked too, packed around the pipe, though it held less heat per pound than sand. He would need a deeper pit or a longer pipe run. Peter asked whether the system worked with lignite. Ragna said it worked with anything that burned hot and clean. Lignite burned dirty, so the cleanouts would need scraping twice as often. But the principle held. Mass did not care what fuel heated it. Mass cared about temperature and time. A railroad cook named Sjur Lunde rode out from the Minot siding to ask whether sand under a bunkhouse stove could keep men warm between shifts. Ragna told him the bunkhouse had advantages: more bodies producing heat, a larger stove, and access to railroad fuel. But the pipe run would need to be longer because the building was longer, and the joints would need inspecting every week because railroad stoves burned hotter and dirtier than domestic ones. In each conversation, Ragna repeated the dangers. No wet sand, no unsealed joints, no flat pipe runs, no hidden pipe without a clean-out. She said these things not as warnings, but as laws, and she said them with the particular authority of a woman who had sealed pipe joints at 28 below with a gashed arm and 2 children sleeping above the work. Nobody argued. Nathan Pike argued. Pike had watched the blizzard from Haskell's back room, where he kept a cot and a ledger and a bottle of whiskey that he did not share. He had done the same arithmetic Reuben had done, the Brecca cabin, the inadequate woodpile, the impossible winter and he had arrived at the same answer. When the storm cleared and the answer turned out to be wrong, Pike did not reconsider. He recalculated. A dead widow meant a cheap claim. A living widow with a method that worked meant something worse. A woman people listened to. A woman who could not be pressured. A woman whose debt no longer guaranteed her departure. Pike's first move was reputation. He told men at Haskell's counter that Ragna had endangered her children by building an unproven heating system in a cabin with no escape route. He pointed out that she had taken in Ellen's family without being asked, crowding the cabin with 7 people and risking everyone if the pipe joints leaked. He said she had gotten lucky. He said the next storm would prove him right. His second move was commercial. He told Haskell he could sell sandbed installations to settlers through the store, Pike's patent prairie warmer, he called it, and that Ragna's free distribution of the design was cutting into potential revenue that could benefit the whole town. The phrase benefit the whole town meant benefit Nathan Pike, and everyone in the store knew it. But knowing a thing and saying it aloud were different skills on the frontier. Ragna heard about Pike's talk from Reuben, who delivered it without commentary and waited for her response. "He can say what he wants," Ragna said. "The floor's warm, and his words are not." But Pike was not done. He was never done. And Ragna knew that a man who wanted her land would not stop wanting it because she survived one storm. Torgrim Asen recovered in Ragna's cabin for 10 days after the blizzard. His frostbitten ears healed slowly, the tips blackened and peeled, and the new skin beneath was pink and tender and hurt when the wind touched it. His hip had worsened from the 8-mile walk in deep cold, and he moved through the cabin in a shuffle that aged him 10 years. But his hands were steady, and his mind was clear, and he spent those 10 days doing what craftsmen do when they find their work has succeeded, improving it. He and Ragna redesigned the clean-out scraper. The original Sansal, a straight iron rod, kolsa, caught on the pipe elbows and could not reach the far corners of the horizontal runs. Torgrim bent a new scraper from a broken wagon spring, angling the tip so it could follow the curve of the elbow joint and drag soot back toward the access point. It was a small improvement. It would prevent a chimney fire that could have destroyed everything. They added a sheet iron heat shield beneath the cookstove legs. The stove sat on the floorboards above the sand bed, and the boards directly under the stove body took the most heat from above and below simultaneously. Torgrim cut a piece of scrap iron from a ruined wash basin and shaped it into a plate that sat between the stove legs and the boards, spreading the heat load and preventing a hot spot that could char through. They marked safe firing instructions on the wall near the stove with charcoal, in letters large enough to read by lamp. Hot, clean, 1 hour. Draft low. Damper after last blue flame. The words looked crude on the plank wall, but Torgrim said that written instructions outlasted the people who gave them, and that mattered more than beauty. On the 6th day of his recovery, Torgrim told Ragna about the best stove he had ever built. It was in a farmhouse near Lillehammer when he was 23 and still an apprentice. The master mason had designed a heater with 6 channels. Exhaust winding through a stone mass that weighed 3 tons. The farmer complained it took 2 days to warm up. The master mason said that was the point. 2 days to warm, 2 days to cool. The farmer never understood. He wanted heat now. The mason wanted heat later. "You understand later," Torgrim said. "That is why this works." "My mother understood later," Ragna said. "I am only remembering what she taught." "Remembering is the first kind of understanding. Building is the second. You have done both." He paused. "Now teach the part I did not know." "What part is that?" How to build this with nothing. I built with stone and mortar and a team of men. You built with river sand and a dead man's pipe and your own hands. That is the part I cannot teach because I never had to learn it. On the 8th day, his hip locked while he was crossing the room, and he fell. Ragna and Eli helped him to the bed. The fall was not dramatic. It was the kind of fall that old men fall. A hitch in the stride, a knee that buckled, a hand that reached for something that was not there. But the hip did not unlock for 2 days, and when Torgrim stood again, he stood differently. Lower, slower, with the careful deliberation of a man who had begun negotiating with his own body and knew he was losing. The frostbite on his ears had healed into hard scar tissue, but something else was wrong. The toes on his left foot, the foot that had been inside a wet boot during the 8-mile walk, had turned dark during the blizzard and had not returned to color. By the 2nd week of February, the smell began. Ragna knew what the smell meant. Every frontier woman knew. Gangrene did not announce itself with pain. It announced itself with sweetness, a thick, false sweetness that settled in the back of the throat and would not leave. Torgrim refused the doctor. The doctor in Minot was a barber who pulled teeth and set bones and charged $2 for either. Torgrim said he had built enough chimneys to know when a structure was failing from the foundation, and no barber was going to change the engineering. He died on the 5th of March, in the early morning, on Ragna's warm floor. He did not die in a speech. He did not deliver final wisdom or squeeze anyone's hand at the dramatic moment. He lay on the bed near the stove and listened to Eli read the firing instructions from the wall, hot, clean, 1 hour now, and somewhere between the word damper and the word after. He stopped breathing. Eli finished the sentence before he realized the room had changed. Ragna sat beside him for an hour. The stove ticked as it cooled. The floor was warm. The sand beneath held the heat of that morning's fire, and it would hold it for hours more, long past the point where the man who had taught her how to seal the joints and set the slope and trust the mass had any use for warmth. She swept the clean out lid that afternoon and found one of Torgrim's chalk marks still on the board beneath, a small arrow pointing toward the pipe outlet, drawn during the installation to show the direction of flow. The house was warm. The teacher was gone. The lesson remained underfoot. Spring came to the Mouse River Flats in late March, not as a gift, but as a different kind of threat. The snow melted fast, too fast. 3 weeks of accumulation turned to water in 6 days, and the Mouse River rose from its winter channel and spread across the flats in a brown sheet that crept closer to the homesteads every morning. The road to Minot became a black mud track that swallowed wagon wheels to the axle and held them there. Ellen's youngest son, Carl, fell through rotten ice near the riverbank on the 1st day of April. He was 4 years old. He went through up to his chest and came out blue-lipped and shaking with a violence that Ellen recognized because she had seen it in her own youngest on Ragna's floor during the blizzard. The doctor could not cross. The road was impassable. Ellen sent Thomas to Ragna. Ragna arrived at Ellen's wash house, where the smaller sand bed was half built, the pipe run laid but the sand not yet packed, and found Carl wrapped in every blanket Ellen owned, shaking on a floor that was cold because the system was not yet complete. She did not have Torgrim. She did not have his tool bag, or his chalk marks, or his voice telling her what to do. She had what he had taught her, and what she had learned by building with her own hands in a cabin where the stakes were measured in children's breaths. She adapted. The washhouse stove was smaller than hers, a squat iron box with a 4-inch pipe. Not enough pipe for a full sand bed, but enough for a warming box. Ragna sent Thomas for bricks from a collapsed chimney 2 homesteads east. She sent Ellen for sand, dry sand from the supply Ellen had already screened. She built a box against the wash house stove wall, bricks on 3 sides, open at the top, packed with dry sand around a short section of 4-inch pipe connected to the stove's exhaust through an existing chimney thimble. The box was crude, 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, 18 inches deep, a fraction of the mass of her cabin sandbed. But the principle was the same. Fire the stove hot. Let the exhaust travel through the pipe inside the sand. Let the sand store the heat. Let the heat radiate into the room after the fire dies. She fired Ellen's stove at noon. By evening, the brick and sand box was warm enough to hold a hand against. She laid Carl on a blanket beside it, close enough to feel the radiating heat, but not close enough to touch the bricks. She heated field stones in rotation, 2 on the stove, 2 wrapped in cloth beside the boy, and kept the cycle going through the night. Carl's shivering stopped by midnight. His color returned by morning. He asked for food at dawn, and Ellen cried in the way that mothers cry when the fear is past, and the body finally allows itself to feel what the mind had been holding at arm's length. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm is already at the door. Ragna walked home through the mud. Her boots were caked to the ankle. Her bandaged arm ached in the damp air. She had not slept. She opened the cabin door and felt the warm floor through her boot soles, and stood there for a moment in the silence of a house where 2 children breathed steadily and the stove ticked, and the sand beneath held what the fire had given. She had built without Torgrim. She had adapted his principles to a smaller space, a weaker stove, a different crisis. She had done the part he could not teach, the part that came from having nothing and making it work anyway. Pike made his next move in April. He hired a man, a laborer named Orrin Falk, who had worked freight wagons and could swing a shovel but had never sealed a pipe joint in his life, to install a sand bed system in a claim shack 4 miles south of Minot. Pike called it the Pike Patent Prairie Warmer and charged the claim holder $12 for materials and labor. He did not consult Ragna. He did not ask about joint compound or pipe slope or clean out access. He copied what he had heard described at Haskell's counter and assumed that hearing was the same as knowing. Orrin Falk dug a pit. He laid pipe. He packed sand, wet sand, straight from the river, unscreened and untested. He sealed the joints with plain river clay. He ran the pipe flat because flat was easier than sloped. He did not install cleanouts because Pike had not mentioned them, and Orrin did not know they existed. The claim holder fired the stove on the second day. Smoke backed up through the flat pipe run and seeped through the wet sand and rose through the floorboards in thin gray threads that smelled like creosote and river mud. The claim holder's 8-year-old daughter began coughing. The family evacuated. No one died, but the girl was sick for a week with headaches and nausea that the Minot barber called stove poisoning. Pike blamed Ragna's design. He told Haskell the whole concept was dangerous, a gimmick invented by a Norwegian widow who did not understand American stoves. He said the claim holder should sue. He said the method should be banned. Ragna heard about the failure from Reuben, who heard it from the claim holder, who had walked to Minot looking for someone to explain why his floor was smoking. She did not wait. She rode Ellen's mule to the claim shack and asked the claim holder's permission to inspect the installation. He gave it. He had nothing to lose. His floor was already ruined. She pulled the boards. She found exactly what she expected: wet sand. She scooped a handful and pressed it. Water beaded between her fingers, sand that would steam for weeks, rotting the boards and trapping moisture against the pipe. Flat pipe. She laid a marble on the horizontal run. It sat still. No slope. Exhaust would pool at every low point. Condensation would accumulate, and soot would pack the pipe shut within a month. Plain clay joints. She pressed her thumbnail into the nearest seam. The clay crumbled. No ash, no hair, no binding agent. The joint had opened during the first firing, and stove gas had seeped through the crack into the sand bed and up through the floor. No cleanouts. The pipe was buried with no access points. If the soot packed it shut, and it would, the entire floor would have to be torn up to reach the pipe. Ragnar asked the claim holder to bring Pike. Pike came. He stood at the edge of the open floor and looked at the ruined installation and said nothing. Ragnar dismantled the faulty pipe run piece by piece, laying each section on the ground beside the shack. She pointed to the flat run. She pointed to the unsealed joint. She held up the wet sand. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She demonstrated, the way Torgrim had demonstrated, by showing, not telling. Reuben stood behind her. He had come without being asked, the way he always came, because someone needed counting, and counting was what Reuben did. "This is not my design," Ragnar said. "This is a copy made by someone who heard the words but did not understand the work." Pike's jaw tightened. "The principle is the same. The principle is physics. The execution is craft. You sold the principle without the craft, and a child is sick because of it." The claim holder looked at Pike. Pike looked at the ground. Reuben looked at Ragnar and said nothing because nothing needed saying. Pike left. He did not offer to refund the $12. He did not apologize to the claim holder. He rode back to Minot and did not mention the prairie warmer at Haskell's counter again, but the damage was done in a different way, the claim holder told his neighbor. The neighbor told the settlers at the Minot feed store. The story became the Norwegian woman's stove design that poisoned a child, and it did not matter that the poisoning was Pike's fault and not Ragnar's. On the frontier, a failure attached itself to the idea, not the execution, and an idea with a dead man's name and a widow's reputation was easier to blame than a freight contractor with money and influence. Ragnar would have to teach faster, teach better, and teach more carefully than before, because Pike had proven something she already knew. Knowledge shared without discipline was more dangerous than knowledge kept. She began holding lessons in her cabin the following week. She made every settler who came hold 2 pieces of pipe, one clean, one choked with soot, and feel the difference in weight. She poured sand into a hot skillet and made them wait for the spit and steam to stop. She asked each family to state their wood count aloud before discussing any design because the math had to come first and the building had to come second. She taught the way Torgrim had taught her, not by lecture but by making people do the work with their own hands until the knowledge lived in their fingers and not just in their ears. Ellen Voigt sat in on every lesson. She had finished her wash house sandbed in mid-March, 4 tons, 20 feet of pipe, 2 clean-out caps, and she could now explain the logic to other women in terms that did not sound like Norwegian engineering, but sounded like what it was. A way to keep your children warm with the wood you had, instead of the wood you wished you had. Ragnar did not charge for the lessons. She did not patent the design. She did not write it down in a document that could be sold or stolen or misused. She taught face to face, hand to hand, joint by joint, because Torgrim had taught her that the only safe way to pass knowledge of fire was to make sure the person receiving it understood the cost of getting it wrong. By the end of April, 5 families had working sand beds or warming boxes. By May, Reuben Tallow refused to approve any buried pipe run unless Ragnar or Ellen inspected the installation first. The knowledge was spreading, and for the first time since Peder died, Ragna felt something she had not permitted herself to feel. Not safety. The frontier did not offer safety. Something smaller and more durable than that. The sense that what she had built could outlast the winter that had tested it and might outlast her. By the autumn of 1887, Ragna Brekka's cabin had become the kind of place that people visited without being invited and left without being asked to stay. Settlers came on horseback, on foot, in wagons that creaked with the weight of questions they did not know how to phrase. They came because Reuben Tallow told them to come, or because Ellen Voigt told their wives, or because they had heard the story at Haskell's counter, the widow who buried 10 tons of river sand under her floor and kept 7 people alive through the worst blizzard in a generation on less than half a cord of wood. They came, and Ragna taught. A typical lesson day began before dawn. Ragna fired the stove, hot and clean, 1-hour dollars, and set the cabin to rights while the sand bed charged. When settlers arrived, usually 2 or 3 families at a time, she started with the math. She asked each family to state their wood count aloud. How many cords? How many weeks of winter? How many people in the cabin? She wrote the numbers on a board with charcoal and let the families see their own arithmetic, the gap between what they had and what they needed, the same gap that had nearly killed her. Then she showed them the pipe. She lifted the loose plank and let them look into the sand bed. She pulled a clean-out cap and showed them the interior of the horizontal run. Soot along the bottom, clear airway above. She sealed the cap and laid a hand on the floor and said, "This sand is still warm from this morning's fire. It will be warm at supper. That is 8 hours of heat from 1 hour of wood." She made them handle the materials. 2 pipe sections, 1 clean, 1 choked. Feel the weight difference. That weight is soot. Soot is fuel that did not burn clean, and soot in a buried pipe is a fire you cannot see and cannot reach. She poured sand into a hot skillet and made them listen. The hiss meant water. Water meant rot. Rot meant your floor collapsed into the pit while your children slept above it. She showed them the joint compound, ash, clay, hair, and made them mix it. Too wet, too dry. Again. She showed them the slope, using Marte's glass marble on a propped board. When the marble rolled slowly toward the outlet end, the slope was right. When it sat still, the pipe was flat, and flat meant death. Ellen Voigt sat in the corner during every lesson, not as an observer, but as a second teacher. She had completed her wash-house installation, and she could answer questions that Ragna's experience had not covered. How to adapt for a smaller space, how to work with a 4-inch pipe instead of 6-inch, how to convince a husband that pulling up the floor in October was not madness, but mathematics. Ellen's presence mattered for a reason that had nothing to do with heating. She was proof that the knowledge could transfer, that it was not locked inside one extraordinary woman's hands, that it could be learned, repeated, and built by anyone willing to do the work. Ragna never turned a family away. She never charged. She never asked for favors in return. But she enforced rules with a severity that surprised people who expected gratitude to make her soft. No installation without a smoke test. No sand without a skillet test. No pipe without 2 clean-out caps. No buried run without someone, Ragna or Ellen, inspecting the joints before the boards went back down. "I am not building stoves," she told Reuben when he asked why she insisted on inspecting every installation herself. "I am building trust in a method that kills if it is done wrong." Deputy Isabel had been watching from a distance that was not quite professional and not quite personal. He had first appeared at Ragna's door in October of 1886, carrying a frost-stiff notice from the creditor, wearing the expression of a man who did not enjoy the part of his work that required delivering bad news to women with children. He was 35, widowed. His wife had died of typhoid 2 years prior in a boarding house in Bismarck, and he had taken the deputy's post in Minot because it was far from the place where she had been sick and close to nothing that reminded him of what he had lost. He had watched the blizzard from the depot where the deputies sheltered when the storm made roads impassable. He had heard the stories afterward: the widow's warm floor, the 7 survivors, the pipe buried in sand. He had filed them under the category of frontier legends, the kind of stories that grew taller with each retelling until the truth was buried under admiration. Then Reuben Tallow asked him to help carry fieldstone for Ellen Voigt's installation, and he found himself standing in Ragna's cabin, holding a flat stone the size of a dinner plate, while Ragna explained where to place it under the pipe elbow for maximum heat distribution. He put the stone where she pointed. She corrected his angle. He adjusted. She nodded. "You know stonework?" she asked. "I know how to follow instructions," he said. She almost smiled. It was the first time he had seen her face move toward something that was not calculation or effort or grief, and it changed the quality of the air in the room in a way that had nothing to do with the sandbed. Asa Bell began appearing at Ragna's cabin with increasing regularity and decreasing official pretense. He came to help carry sand for Halvor Moen's ridge installation. He came to help dig the pit for the schoolhouse warming wall that Ragna designed in June, a vertical version of the sandbed built against the interior wall of the one-room school, with a pipe run embedded in a brick and sand panel that stored heat from the morning fire and released it through the afternoon when the stove was cold and the children were fidgeting. He came because the work needed doing, and he stayed because Ragna needed someone who carried without being asked and listened without offering advice she had not requested. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through labor. They hauled clay together from the riverbank. They screened sand side by side, the mesh between them, the pale grains falling through in a shared rhythm. He held pipe sections while she sealed joints. She marked the boards while he lifted them. They did not discuss feelings. They discussed slope and draft and joint compound, and somewhere inside those conversations, something else was being built, quieter than a sandbed, less measurable, but no less real. The first time Asa corrected a settler who asked him a technical question about the sandbed, "Ask Mrs. Brecka," he said without hesitation, in front of 3 men who expected the deputy to know more than the widow. Ragnar looked at him across the cabin and understood that this man would not try to own what she had built. He would carry what she marked. There were men on the frontier who would have taken her method and made it theirs, who would have married the inventor and become the inventor. Asa Bell was not one of them. He had spent 2 years grieving a woman he could not save, and he recognized in Ragna something he had no interest in diminishing, a competence so deep it lived in her hands, and a stubbornness so complete it had kept her children alive when every reasonable calculation said they should have died. He asked her, in September of 1887, whether he could bring his tools to her lean-to and repair the roof before winter. She said yes. He did not move in. He moved closer. The distinction mattered to both of them. Pike's final reckoning came in November, a late autumn cold snap. Not a blizzard, not a catastrophe, just 3 days of 15 below with wind caught the region before most settlers had finished their winter preparations. Pike's freight store in Minot had a back room where he kept inventory, ledgers, and the cot where he slept when the roads were bad. The room had a small stove, a single pipe, and no insulation beyond the plank walls of the store building. The cold snap froze the ink in Pike's ledger. It froze the water in his wash basin. It froze the jars of molasses on the top shelf hard enough that 2 of them cracked and bled black syrup down the wall when they thawed. Pike's own stove, a standard iron box, well-maintained, burning, seasoned wood, could not keep the back room above 40 degrees because the building leaked heat through every seam, and the pipes sent half the fire's energy straight through the roof. He burned through his dry fuel supply in 2 days. On the third day, he sat in the cold back room with his coat buttoned to his chin and his breath visible in the lamplight, and he understood in his body what Ragna had understood in her mind 11 months earlier. The problem was not the fire. The problem was what happened to the heat after the fire burned. He sent word through Haskell, not a demand, not an offer, a request. Could Mrs. Brecky provide instructions for installing a heat storage system in the back room of the freight store? Haskell delivered the message with the discomfort of a man caught between a creditor he feared and a widow he respected. Ragna listened. She did not gloat. She did not refuse. She set terms. She would provide instructions and inspect the installation. In exchange, Pike would cancel the Brecky debt, all $34.70, and he would pay Ellen Voigt's medical account at the barber's office, incurred when Ellen's daughter had needed treatment after the spring flooding. Pike sent back a counter. He would cancel the debt, but not pay Ellen's account. That was not his obligation. Ragna sent back a reply, both or nothing. She had enough wood. Pike arrived at the cabin expecting private negotiation. He found Reuben Tallow seated by the stove, Ellen Voigt standing by the door, and Deputy Asa Bell leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his badge visible on his coat. Ragna had prepared a document. Asa had helped her write it. Cancellation of the Breca store debt. Payment of Ellen Voigt's medical account. Both signed in the presence of witnesses. Pike read the paper. His face went through several colors that had nothing to do with the cold. He looked at Reuben, who looked back without expression. He looked at Ellen, who looked back without blinking. He looked at Asa Bell, whose crossed arms said everything his badge did not. "Your floor heat is worth more than my paper," Pike said. "Then paper should not decide who freezes," Ragna said. Pike signed. The pen scratched against the rough paper, and the sound was small and ordinary, the sound of a man conceding not to a principle, but to a circumstance he could not outlast. Reuben witnessed. Ellen witnessed. Asa Bell witnessed. Pike took the installation instructions, written on a board in charcoal, because Ragna did not waste paper on men who wasted trust, and left. He did not say thank you. He did not shake hands. He walked to his horse and rode back to Minot, and for the rest of that winter his back room stayed warm enough to keep the ink liquid and the molasses poured. His conversion was not moral. It was mechanical. The cold had done what Ragna's words could not. It had demonstrated, in the language Pike understood best, that physics did not negotiate, and that heat obeyed laws that no amount of money could repeal. By the spring of 1888, Ragna had helped install or supervise 9 heat storage systems across the settlements near Minot. 3 were full underfloor sand beds, 8x8 pits with 10-ton capacity, modeled on her original design. Halvor Moen's ridge cabin used 1, adapted for the clay-heavy soil of his property with a deeper pit and longer pipe run. Peter Stensland built one with his brother's help, using lignite fuel with clean-out scraped every 5 days. 4 were smaller sand benches, built against stove walls in cabins where cutting the floor was not practical. These used 3 to 4 tons of sand in a brick-sided box with a shorter pipe run, producing less stored heat, but enough to extend a fire's warmth by 4 to 5 hours in moderate cold. One was the schoolhouse warming wall, Ragna's vertical design, a brick and sand panel built against the interior wall, heated by a pipe run embedded in the mass. The school teacher reported that children no longer kept their ink bottles inside their shirts to prevent freezing, and that the afternoon lessons ran longer because the room stayed warm after the lunch fire died. One was Pike's back room. Ragna inspected it herself. The joints were sealed. The slope was correct. The clean-outs were accessible. She said nothing when she finished. Pike said nothing. The installation spoke for itself. Ragna married Asa Bell in the spring of 1889 after Dakota statehood. The ceremony was brief, held in the cabin, with Reuben Tallow as witness and Ellen Voigt as the only guest who brought food. Ragna kept the Breka name on the land papers. The claim was hers. The name was hers. The sand under the floor was hers. Asa understood this the way he understood everything about her, not as a condition to negotiate, but as a fact to respect. They had one child together, a boy born in 1890, named Torsten after no one Asa had known, and everyone Ragna remembered. Eli grew into a carpenter who could seal a pipe joint in his sleep and who built 3 sand beds of his own before he turned 20. Marte survived childhood, survived the cough, survived the fever, survived the blizzard, and kept Torgrim's measuring stick in a drawer wrapped in oilcloth. She brought it out on the first cold day of every autumn and measured the pipe slope in Ragna's cabin, running the marble, checking the angle, keeping the number true. The years compressed the way years do on the plains, marked not by dates, but by seasons, by storms, by the quiet rhythms of a life built on ground that never stopped trying to kill the people who lived on it. Ragna taught through the 1890s. She taught women first, then their husbands, then their children. She taught by hand, by demonstration, by the skillet test and the marble and the 2 pieces of pipe, one clean, one choked. She did not patent the design. She did not sell it. She did not write it down in any form more permanent than charcoal on a board, because she believed that knowledge of fire belonged to the people who needed it, not the people who could afford it. The method never became a factory product. It never carried a brand name. Settlers called it Breka's sand bed, and the name stuck the way names stick on the frontier, not because anyone trademarked it, but because it was accurate. Reuben Tallow died in 1893 in his soddy on a mild February night when the stove burned low and the sand bench beside it kept the room at 60 degrees until morning. He died warm, which was the only epitaph he would have accepted. Ellen Voigt moved her family to Bismarck in 1895 when her husband sold the homestead to a cattle company. She taught 3 families in Bismarck the sandbed method before she stopped teaching, not because the knowledge had faded, but because the city had coal furnaces and the urgency had passed. She kept the skillet, the one Ragna had used for the dryness test, hung on a nail in her kitchen. She never used it for cooking. Ragna Breka Bell lived out her later years on the Mouse River claim. She was never wealthy. She never needed to be. The debt was gone. The children were grown. The cabin had been expanded twice. Once in 1891, when Asa added a bedroom, and once in 1897, when the original sand bed was extended beneath the new room. The second bed used 8 tons instead of 10 because Ragna had refined the pipe route and the firing rhythm and found that less mass with better insulation and tighter joints could match the original performance. She kept Torgrim's measuring stick above the stove. She marked each winter's first firing with a line of chalk on the wall, a row of white lines that grew longer every year, each one a winner entered and survived, each one a debt paid to the man who had taught her to seal the joints and trust the mass. Ragna died in the spring of 1919 in the cabin on the floor, with Marte and Eli beside her, and the boards warm beneath the quilt they laid her on. The stove was cold. The sand was warm. It had always been warm in the winters, in the years, in the particular silence of a house that remembered fire long after fire was gone. By the winter that followed her death, at least 12 families across the settlements near the Mouse River knew some version of Ragna's rules. Even those who never built a full sand bed knew the principles. Quarter-inch rise per foot, dry sand only, seal every joint, cleanouts where hands can reach. The rules lived in chalk marks on walls, in charcoal on boards, in the muscle memory of women who had mixed the joint compound with their own hands and felt it grip. Ragna Brekki Bell survived a winter that should have killed her, kept 7 people alive on a floor that should have been frozen, and taught a method that outlasted the woman who built it. She never left the Mouse River claim. She never sought an audience larger than the one that stood in her cabin and pressed their palms to the warm boards and understood. She died at 74, and the cabin paid her started and she finished, with Torgrim's measuring stick still above the stove and a row of chalk lines on the wall that counted 33 winners. Marte closed her eyes. Eli stood at the door. The floor was warm. In January of 1887, the temperature had fallen to 41 below zero, and the wind had driven snow against the cabin walls until the windows went dark. Nathan Pike had pointed at the open pit and said, "You are building a grave under your stove." Reuben Tallow had counted the wood and said, 6 cords or coffins. The railroad men had called it a beach for ghosts. Raganabrika had said nothing. She had hauled the river into her kitchen. She had buried the pipe in the sand. She had fired the stove hot and clean and closed the damper after the last blue flame, and the sand had held what the fire gave, and the floor had given it back to her children, to Ellen's children, to a man with frost-bitten ears who died on warm boards he helped build. The river had been under her feet all winter, holding the fire until her children needed it. Word count 5508, total script. Word count 22,371 tension peak locations. Word at 500. Teaching authority. Ragna enforces strict rules, tension between open sharing and dangerous misapplication. Word or 1000. Asabel introduction. The deputy who delivered the debt notice returns in a different role. Word 1500. Courtship through work. The schoolhouse warming wall. Shared labor. The Ask Mrs. Greca moment. Word 2000. Pike's cold snap. His own back room freezes, ink and molasses crack, fuel runs out. Word 2500. Hostile skeptic confrontation. Pike forced to request help. Ragna sets terms. Word 3000. Public reckoning. Pike signs in front of Reuben, Ellen, Asa. Paper should not decide who freezes. Word to 3500. Full-scale operation. 9 installations cataloged, each with specific adaptations. Word 14,000. Compressed years. Marriage. Children. Marty keeping Torgrim's measuring stick. Word 4,500. Reuben's death on a warm sand bench. Ellen's departure with the skillet. Word to 5,100. Echo close. Pike's quote. Reuben's quote. The warm floor. The final image.